Hello, this is Piyungsak Wiliya Banditgun, introducing another podcast by Asian Agribiz. Today, my colleague Rajeswari Lamani will be discussing with industry experts from Elanco about the fear of AGP residues in meats being passed on to consumers.
In our podcast today, we will be addressing antibiotic growth promoter or AGP reduction in swine feed without it affecting the health of hogs, which could contribute to loss of herds to diseases, hence loss of profitability. AGP overuse could lead to microbial resistance, although evidence linking this to resistance in humans is controversial. Nevertheless, many countries in Europe have banned them and more are following suit, except for therapeutic usage. But how will this affect swine farmers in Asia, where the region is rapidly building back herds culled by the African swine fever? We speak to Dr. Roselle Cudal, Technical Consultant for Swine, and Dr. Shabbir Simjee, Chief Medical Officer, both from Elanco. Welcome, doctors. My first question is for Dr. Shab. Dr. Shab, can you tell us how does meat with AGP residue pass on their resistance to humans, the types of AGP that does, and their effects?
Yeah, sure. That's actually a very broad question. And I think the first thing that we need to do is address the fact that residues don't necessarily cause resistance. I think there's a lot of confusion, broadly speaking, between residues and the development of resistance. In theory, what people think is that you use an antibiotic in the food producing animal, and in this case an AGP use, and that AGP is going to somehow lead to resistance in humans. That's not exactly the way it works. So what we have is that you have an antibiotic used for growth promotion purposes in the animal, and the underlying concept is the use of that antibiotic would lead to resistance development in bacteria in the animal, and it's that bacteria which is now resistant that goes through the food chain. But one thing that we need to keep in mind is that the levels of AGP, so the concentration of drug used at an AGP dose is extremely low. So it doesn't necessarily offer that selective pressure for bacteria to become resistant. Now, if we look at the flip side of this, which is, does the use of that drug lead to a residue in the meat, which then goes through the food chain, and does that residue then cause resistance in humans? I think the first thing that we need to understand is that most antibiotics that are going to be used as AGP are used in a medicated feed form, which means the drug itself is going to have some level of protection as it passages through the animal's stomach, where there's a very high acid concentration and it can degrade the drug. So the drug has to be in a protected form till it reaches the animal's intestine, where it then becomes an active form of the drug. Now, for that drug to lead to residue in meat, the drug has to escape from the intestinal tract. So you're already administering a very low dose of drug to the animal. And so what may escape, which is very minimal amounts of drug, are going to be in such small quantities that they are not likely to lead to resistance development in human. You've got to also look at the causal pathway. So you've got the drug that's already in low concentrations being given to the animal. Let's say 25% of that, which is still a high number, but it's very unlikely to be that high. But let's say 25% escapes into the meat. You've got the half-life of the drug, so the drug's going to be degrading over time. That meat is then going to be cooked, so a level of drug's going to degrade there. That meat's going to go through the human intestinal or human stomach first. The acid in the stomach is most likely going to degrade the drug as well. So by the time the drug reaches the intestine of the human, there's very minuscule amounts left. Also bear in mind that we have something called maximum residue limits. so MRLs. These are typically set at multiples of thousands below what the threshold needs to be. It's almost like saying that you're driving towards a cliff and you have a warning sign about 100 miles away to say, be careful, cliff ahead. Those are the kind of safety limits that we set on what the tolerable level of drug should be in an animal. And those levels take into consideration all sorts of aspects. One of them is, would that concentration of drug lead to resistance in the human gut? So there's a lot of misconceptions about antibiotics themselves at AGP levels leading to resistant bacteria which go through the food chain. And related to your question, there's a lot of misconceptions around the whole residue piece leading to resistance. The bottom line is we have maximum residue limit tolerances set for all food animal species. And as long as those MRLs are observed, there is next to no risk of any residues leading to resistance in humans.
Thank you, Dr. Shab. Can you also explain what are the pros and cons of totally removing these AGPs from swine production?
Yeah, sure. So I think, in your opening intro, you mentioned the European situation. And Europe banned the use of AGPs at the end of 2005. So from 2006, AGPs were no longer allowed in the European Union. I think that wasn't exactly the best approach, and it was not based on scientific data. It was more the precautionary principle that was taken by Europe. All eyes were then on the US to see how the US Food and Drug Administration would address the whole issue of AGPs. And the US waited they waited over a decade to do anything. And the US had more of a pragmatic approach, which is aligned with the WHO's approach to AGPs. And the WHO split antibiotics into medically important versus non-medically. So medically important means those antibiotic classes that are used in human medicine. And non-medically important antimicrobials would be those classes that are not used in human medicine. And the approach taken by the FDA, and it's aligned with the WHO approach, is that medically important antibiotics should not be used in food-producing animals for AGP use. And the FDA made that a legal requirement in 2017. So it's about 11 years after the European banned AGPs. So the Europeans took a totally precautionary principle approach, whilst the FDA, aligned with the WHO, took more of a risk assessment based approach. And one of the reasons for doing that is if you look at what happened in Europe, Europe banned the use of AGPs. We saw more disease outbreaks, and swine is a good example. And we'll take Denmark. So when the AGP ban came in, Denmark was using about 60 tons of antibiotics in pig production. Post AGP ban, within 2 years, that 60 tons had become 120 tons, and pig production did not increase by the same amount. There was very little increase in pig production output, yet there was 100% increase in therapeutic use. Now that therapeutic use of antibiotic led to higher levels of resistance being observed in your two foodborne pathogens, which are Campylobacter and Salmonella. Mm-hmm. So by banning AGP, what we saw was more disease outbreaks in pigs, and with that more disease outbreaks, farmers were being forced to use therapeutic antibiotics, so medically important antibiotics for therapeutic purposes. That's mm-hmm. treatment, control, and prevention. And by using more medically important antibiotics, we saw a substantial increase in the percentage of resistance, especially in your foodborne pathogens, which obviously has a knock-on effect to human health. So there's obviously pros and cons, and obviously, since that Europe has improved biosecurity, hygiene. There's a whole heap of other measures that have come in, but that's all been at the expense of the farmers. And the farmers have had to pay for all of that. If we look at smallholders across Asia, they're not on big profit margins. There's no way they can afford such infrastructure like the ones we have in Europe. So a better approach in Asia would be what the FDA's done in the US. And again, I will emphasize the fact that approach is also supported by the WHO, which says that medically important antibiotics should not be used for AGP, but non-medically important antibiotics, following a risk assessment process, have shown that they are safe, they don't contribute to resistance in humans, and they are okay to be used as AGPs.
Okay, thank you so much for that explanation. This question is for Dr. Roselle. Mm-hmm. How can swine farmers successfully transition their herds, and what feed, biology, and disease management strategies would be involved?
Thank you, Raj. That is indeed a key question. And it is a cliche, but it is true that prevention is better than cure. So strategies along the line of prevention will need to be done to be more specific on when there is a need to medicate, if a disease occurs or is about to occur. You asked first about what feed strategies. So feed mills will need to implement good biosecurity and undergo quality checks and audits regularly. So they are part of mitigating disease entry into farms. And at the same time, they should provide the precise nutrition needed for optimum performance and health. The second one you asked is biology. The pig itself has to become immunologically strong, able to fight back pathogens. And this is where, again, nutrition comes in, and of course, vaccines may come in as well. The last one is management. Farms must apply biosecurity principles. The first one is segregation. And for me, as a veterinarian that is doing internal biosecurity, pig flow, you can do batch management and all in, all out. Those are key in segregation. So that the second and third element of proper cleaning and disinfection can be done properly in between the batches of pigs that occupy the pig pens and buildings. This will stop disease transmission between batches of pigs and, in turn, lower the need for interventions like medications. All of these are actually basics in swine farming. So a farm transitioning to any change from the status quo, like using AGP extensively as a sort of, how would you call that, a compensation for not doing the basics, they will need these good strategies to be put in place so that they can do the transition well.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Roselle. In our earlier article in the Asian Pork magazine about the same topic, some producers spoke about using alternative or enhanced feed. So what would these be?
There are a lot of options, of course. Some are already looking at probiotics, some at precision nutrition, just putting exactly what is needed there. These are all good because this will support nutrition. And as I said, nutrition is key in having good performance, optimum health. However, in the situation of the farm where there is a lot of biosecurity concerns and, entry points, vectors and fomites abound and pathogens do come in, once a pig gets sick, they have to be treated. Okay? And if it's a bacterial infection or a bacterial co-infection for that matter, we need to treat, and in-feed medication remains to be the most convenient way where we can medicate, big herds of swine. So we can still have the option of injectables and water, but for, big operations, the in-feed medication is the fastest way that we can do medication in these pigs.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Roselle. Back to Dr. Shab. Given the current disease situation in the industry, where medically important AGP usage is still prevalent, what are some of the measures that needs to be put in place to get producers on board?
Yes, I think it goes back to what we spoke about a little while ago. I think the biggest thing that's missing right now is in most of the countries across Asia, the whole concept of risk assessment is missing. We need to firstly educate farmers and veterinarians on the fundamental differences between medically and non-medically important antibiotics. And although it sounds kind of, it seems like you would assume they know, there is still a lot of misunderstanding between these terms, medically and non-medically important antibiotics. So I think it's partly an issue of getting education out there, and this article serves as a great way of doing that. More importantly, is trying to get the local regulatory agencies across the ASEAN countries to embrace the concept of risk assessment and rely on risk assessment to drive their policy. And this is exactly what's being done in the USA. That's why they've come up with this non-medically important antibiotics are okay to use as AGP concept. Now, it's easy to say follow risk assessment processes. To develop a risk assessment, it's not easy. You need local antibiotic resistance monitoring data. Now, on the human side, that data is very readily available, partly because there's a lot of seed funding that comes from the WHO that allows countries to do human AMR monitoring. But for a risk assessment, you need both the human and the veterinary data. And it's that veterinary antibiotic resistance monitoring data that's missing. Now, you can't expect the industry or the veterinary sectors to generate that data. It's not cheap to do. And there's always this feeling that if the industry generates the data and the data looks good, it gets questioned that, they're not being totally transparent. In Europe, in the US, it's the government that generates the data. So you've got the NARM surveillance program in the US, you've got SIPARS in Canada, you've got DANMAP, Moran, SWAM, VARS. These are all European surveillance programs funded by each country. And that's what needs to happen across the ASEAN countries. The government need to build the infrastructure and the capabilities and capacity to do surveillance work. And then that data can be used in a national risk assessment, which then supports that the use of non-medically important antibiotics would be okay to be used as AGP. So I think there's multiple steps needed. Education definitely is a big thing, and it's not only to support AGP use. We do need to slowly move away from AGPs over time, but we need to offer the farmers, the veterinarians, an alternative to the AGPs. So you've got nutritional health, which could help. Vaccines may help to a limit, but at the same time, they also need to rely on better animal husbandry, better biosecurity. And a lot of that just comes through the education process.
Okay, that's a good insight. Just to throw a question in there, there seems, like what you said, there seems to be a lot of misinformation, and a lot of this probably involves consumers as well. And it seems that the industry is being pushed into this reducing AGPs because of consumers. So in the wider range, how would we drive the policy that not all AGPs are bad, and how do we reach the consumers if they are going to be influencers in this?
I think again, it's getting the right consumers to be more vocal on social media. It's an educational piece again. I'll go back to the US. The consumers, there was a big push in the US to go antibiotic free in poultry. A good example, right? So the industry delivered. The industry, about 50% of the poultry industry went antibiotic free in the US. And they met what the consumers asked for, but that wasn't cheap. There was a price cost associated with it. So once the consumers had antibiotic-free meat, but they saw the price tag, they weren't willing to pay for it. So they went back to buying conventional meat, and farmers were stuck with all these overpriced birds that they then had to sell at a loss rather than even breaking even. So is getting the consumers to understand how food animals raised, explain to them what the risk is of using AGPs and what is the risk of not using AGPs. Explain to them that there's additional costs involved. There's going to be more disease outbreaks if you don't use the AGPs. And that's been shown again using the data from Denmark. So if there's more disease outbreaks, there's going to be less animals reaching market. Less animals reaching market means costs go up. Are you willing to pay for that extra cost? So I think there's that kind of education that the end user needs as well to help them understand. That is great to make all these demands, but you've got to balance the practicalities of that as well.
That's really interesting. That's really great. Okay, back to Dr. Roselle. What is the difference we can expect in herds that has been transitioned or managed with responsible AGPs? And how does this benefit farmers in terms of profitability?
That is a good question, because removing AGPs had already been shown to be a viable practice in farms. Take, for example, our compatriots in the poultry industry. For swine farms to make the transition, and some have done so, they need to invest more, specifically in actions that promote health. This means farms will need to invest heavily in having good management practices, meaning they professionalize their workforce to ensure the quality in their husbandry standard operating procedures. They need to do audits, including their biosecurity programs. And they need to do diagnostically supported vaccination programs, and even changes in their medication need to be tested as well with antibiotic sensitivity tests. These are basics in swine farming, but not all of them are being done because, again, it requires investment. So the reliance on AGP and the ability to transform or to transition may be dependent on the level of strategies that the farmer is able to implement. It was pointed out by Dr. Sharabs earlier that might not be applicable for the smallholder in Asia. Health should really be viewed as an important driver of profitability, because the healthier the pigs, the less interventions will need to be done when there is a disease concern. The healthier the pigs, the lesser the lost opportunities for the farmer, and that means, in effect, more profit for the farmer.
Okay, that's great. We come to the end of our podcast, and I would like to thank both Dr. Roselle and Dr. Shab for giving us very detailed information about the differences in AGP and why banning all of them may not be necessary, looking at all the current data surrounding them.
Thank you.
Thank you for giving us the opportunity.
With this podcast, I hope you have armed yourself with some basic knowledge on how AGP residues work. Please tune in again for another podcast where we bring you the most exclusive of news and data. You may read the summary of the podcast at www.asian-agribiz.com.